Welcome to the Gorgeous Nothings, and many thanks to my colleagues Leslie Morris and Heather Cole for so generously offering tours of the Dickinson room and for organizing the Amy Lowell exhibit that surrounds us this evening. When Walt Whitman sent enclosures with his letters, he would signify this to his recipients with the phrase, "I send you the within." For Dickinson and her envelope poems, you can almost hear her say, "I send you the without." In the dynamic circulation that constituted one of her primary modes of publication, letters and poems were sent to friends and family, and the exterior of the envelopes that she received back were in turn used as the canvas for future poems. The word envelope emerges from two different etymologies, to cover and enclose, and to be involved in, and seems to embody the duality at the heart of Dickinson's work, the solitariness and intense sociability that catalyzed one another. Several decades after Dickinson's death, Virginia Woolf used the metaphor of an envelope to describe human experience. A semi-transparent envelope, she writes, surrounds us from the beginning of consciousness. In that same essay, Woolf urges us to attend to the fragmentary matter and minutiae of existence. Let us record, she writes, the atoms as they fall upon the mind. Let us not take it for granted that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than what is commonly thought small. Tonight, I am privileged to introduce visual artist and poet Jen Bervin and scholar Marta Werner, who have brought just such an attentiveness to bear on Dickinson's fragments and gorgeous nothings, treating them with equal dignity as both text and textile, withins and withouts, helping us to apprehend, literally returning to our hands, the magnitude of these works. I think of these manuscripts, writes Bervin, as the sort of small fabric Dickinson describes when she writes, "Excuse Emily and her atoms. The North Star is of small fabric, but it implies much precise." Sorry, it's painful to misquote Dickinson, but anyway. Excuse Emily and her atoms. The North Star is of small fabric, but it implies much presides yet. When we say small, we often mean less, writes Bervin. When Dickinson says small, she means atoms, the North Star. Please welcome the stars of this evening, Jen Bervin and Marta Werner.
Thank you so much for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure and an honor, and particularly a pleasure and an honor to kind of open for Jen Bervin and the Gorgeous Nothings. Itineraries of Escape, Emily Dickinson's Envelope Poems. 1. The Wheels of Birds. Collections unlock themselves once a single piece is brought to voice. In the beginning was the exemplary object, which opens up the way to thought as if by itself. Groups of documents arise from it, from the editors of Walter Benjamin's archive. Among Emily Dickinson's latest writings is such an exemplary manuscript. Identified solely by its catalog number, AA21, it constitutes a kind of exit text. It may have been composed in a few minutes or even a few seconds in the early spring of 1885, since one line of the text reappears, slightly altered, in 3 fair copy drafts of a letter from Dickinson to Helen Hunt Jackson, composed around March of that year, but apparently never mailed. In Thomas H. Johnson and Theodora Ward's The Letters of Emily Dickinson, the envelope poem is annexed to these drafts as a footnote. Its provenance, however, as well as the date of its composition, remain unconfirmed. I found it first by accident in the Amherst College Library when it fell or rose out of an acid-free envelope out of the space of claustration. If I had not held it lightly in my hands, I would never have suspected the manner in which it was assembled. Although its brevity and immediacy place it outside the reach of conventional classificatory gestures, it bears a striking affinity to the genre David Porter names small, rickety infinitudes. Look at it here, flying on the page, vying with light. AA21 is a sudden collage made of 2 sections of envelope. The principles of its construction are economical, even austere. The larger section of the collage is the inside of the back of an envelope, the address face of which has been torn or cut away. One vertical crease bisects the document, turning the halved envelope into a primitive diptych that resembles the hinged wings of the bird the manuscript is becoming. Initially, the leaves' wings appear to have been folded closed. At rest, the manuscript has not yet metamorphosed into a fully living figure. The other section of the text, designated by the cataloger A821A, is composed on an unfolded triangular corner of an envelope seal. A single straight pin, in place when I first saw the manuscript many years ago, but later removed, originally imped the collage elements together, while also spreading open the larger envelope fragment to reveal a blurred message about an imminent transition or about the desire of writing to intervene between the visible and the invisible. On the right wing, the lines afternoon and the west and the gorgeous nothings, which compose the sunset, keep their slant upward into the west. On the left wing, the lines clogged only with music, like the wheels of birds, slant diagonally upward into the east. On the smaller pinned wing, writing rushes beyond the tear or terminus, where the seen meets the unseen in their high appointment. The singing of birds marks, some believe causes, both the break and the close of day. If we read from left to right across the contours of the open wings, AA21, AA21A appears to record the moment when day falls into night. Yet the grammar or syntax of wings is the grammar of discontinuity. The slight variations in the handwriting on opposing wings suggest that the texts they carry were composed on different occasions. Moreover, on each wing, writing, inscribed by velocity, rushes in opposite directions. To access the texts and to answer the question of where we have arrived, we must enter into a volitional relationship with the fragment, turning it point by point like a compass or a pinwheel, like the wheels of thought, 360 degrees. As we rotate the text, orienting and disorienting it at once, day and night, each a whir of words, almost converge in the missing body spaces just beyond the light seams, showing the bifurcation in the envelope, then fly apart in a synesthesia of sight and sound. Joy and gravitation, Dickinson wrote in another late unclassifiable text, have their own ways. Gravity fields. The instantaneous translation from one condition into another radically different one defines the experience of AA21 and of so many of Dickinson's late and ecstatic writings. Ultimately, the fragment's textual status as a fugitive or exile is related not only to its extrageneric quality, but also to its migration between and among texts and to its capacity to survive outside all of the texts that so briefly shelter it. Even within the interstices of Dickinson's letter drafts that at first seemed to repatriate and master the lyric fragment, AA21 marks the place where the amanuensis comes, slipping between registers in a voice at once immediate and alien, turning prose back into poetry and writing the text apart. Initially, though, the strange vibration of AA21 comes from a crossing of wires between Helen Hunt Jackson's 3 February 1885 letter to Dickinson containing news of her prolonged suffering from a broken leg and Dickinson's belated response in March. Santa Monica, California, by the sea, February 3rd, 1885. My dear Miss Dickinson, thank you heartily for the fan. It is pathetic in its smallness. Poor souls, how did they come to think of making such tiny ones? I shall wear it sometimes, like a leaf on my breast. Your letter found me in Los Angeles, where I have been for 2 months and a little more, sunning myself and trying to get on my feet. I had hoped by this time to be able to go without crutches and venture to New York for the remainder of the winter, but I am disappointed. So far as the broken leg is concerned, I could walk with a cane now, but the whole leg, having been badly strained by doing double duty so long, is obstinate about getting to work again, is very lame and sore, and I am afraid badly given out, so it will take months for it to recover. I dislike this exceedingly, but dare not grumble, lest a worse thing befall me. And if I did grumble, I should deserve it, for I am absolutely well, drive the whole of every afternoon in an open carriage on roads where larks sing and flowers are in bloom. I can do everything I ever could except walk, and if I never walk again, it will still remain true that I have had more than a half-century's excellent trotting out of my legs. So even then, I suppose I ought not be rebellious. Few people get so much out of one pair of legs as I have. This Santa Monica is a lovely little seaside hamlet, only 18 miles from Los Angeles, one of the most beautiful seaside places I ever saw, green to the tip edge of the cliffs, flowers blooming, and choruses of birds all winter. There can be nothing in this world nearer perfection than this South California climate for winter, cool enough to make a fire necessary night and morning, but warm enough to keep the flowers going all the time in the open air. Grass and barley are many inches high, some of the volunteer crops already in head. As I write, in bed before breakfast, I am looking straight off towards Japan, over a silver sea. My foreground is a strip of high grass and mallows, with a row of eucalyptus trees 60 or 70 feet high, and there is a positive cackle of linnets. I hope you are well, and at work. I wish I knew by now what your portfolios by this time hold. Yours ever truly, Helen Jackson. The epistolary relation is grounded in and exposed to time. When Dickinson received her friend's letter, she began drafting a response. Several drafts, redacted here into one, are extant. Dear friend, to reproach my foot, my own foot, in behalf of yours is involuntary, and finding myself no solace, in whom he loveth he chasteneth, your valor astounds me. It was only a small wasp, said the French physician repairing the sting, but the strength to perish is sometimes withheld, though who but you could tell a foot? Take all away from me, but leave me ecstasy, and I am richer then than all my fellow men. Is it becoming me to dwell so wealthily, when at my very door are those possessing more in abject poverty? That you compass, glance at Japan before you breakfast, not in the least surprises me, clogged, thronged only with music, like the wheels, decks of birds. Thank you for hoping I am well. Who could be ill in March, that month of proclamation? Sleigh bells and jays contend in my matinee, and the North surrenders instead of the South, a reverse of bugles. Knew I how to pray, to intercede for your foot were intuitive, but I am but a pagan. May I once more know, and that you are saved? Your Dickinson. Dickinson was writing. She had signed one draft. Perhaps she was even ready to seal it up in an envelope and send it on its way. But before she could make these final preparations, the newspapers announced Jackson's death. Dickinson's carefully drafted response to Jackson's morning letter reaches its destination only in the night of its intended recipient. Cut to A821, clogged only with music like the wheels of birds. Look at it for a last time, flying on the screen, vying with light. Unlike the letter proper, a narrative of illness and death, boundlessly gravid, the undated because dateless fragment is a site of radical temporality. In the visual linguistics of an early mystical imagery and Edenic metaphysics, wings, wheels are signifiers for immateriality, for bodies that are not subject to the laws of gravity. Wings, wheels can communicate between time and eternity. By composing A821, A821A on the reverse of an empty, unaddressed envelope, no longer the container for a message, but the message itself, Dickinson creates a template for flight that is also a trope for her late contrapuntal communications, in which arrival is another name for departure. If we look closely at the body of AA21, 4 additional sets of pinpricks, 2 along the outer edges of the left wing and 2 along the outer edges of the right wing, are revealed. The tiny holes may be signs that the fragment was imped to other texts, composed before or after the letter to Hunt Jackson, signs that writing is subject to changes in course, to multiple defections. A821 may be a time-shifted bird flown out of the constellation of March, a poem breaking out of prose, a letter's vanishing point. In such a case, the expectations of closure, their high appointment, may be endlessly postponed or reversed by the drop of a pin. To say the least, the common meter of the hymn found in Dickinson's early bound poems has not survived this latest flight. In A21, A21A, a sudden acceleration is followed by a short-circuiting of lyrical cables. In place of melody and measure comes suddenness and syncope. Meter with neither more nor less, but an impossible measure. In the end, A821 flies to the outermost edges of Dickinson's works, then out of this world, no bird, but rode in ether. In August, perhaps, of 1885, on postal wrappers, Dickinson composed a last ecstatic postscript to Hunt Jackson. "Dear friend, can you walk?" were the last words I wrote her. "Dear friend, I can fly," her immortal, soaring reply. A further migration. W.H. Hudson says that birds feel something akin to pain and fear just before migration, and that nothing alleviates this feeling except flight, the rapid motion of wings. Laureen Niedecker. A821, A821A comes not alone, but as one migrant among many. It is the harbinger, moreover, of Dickinson's furthest flight, that beyond the 40 bound fascicles, the accumulated libraries of her poetic production, into a freer air, where, to cite her contemporary Ralph Waldo Emerson, contrary and remote things seem to cohere. At this juncture, Dickinson no longer thinks of keeping what she acquires through the labor of writing, and her attitude of astonishing recklessness is reflected in her new practice of writing on anything near to hand, chocolate wrappers, the margins of books, scraps of paper. Among the makeshift and fragile textual homes for Dickinson's late writings, we find about 50 envelopes. The nature of Dickinson's connection to these writings she left behind her remains mysterious. For while it is unlikely that she deliberately set out to compose a series of poems, messages, and fragments on envelopes, once we have seen the documents, it becomes difficult to dissociate the texts from their carriers. Flocked together for a few moments before dispersing again into other equally provisional qualifications and classifications, they also remind us that archives are not always founded on the principles of order, comprehensiveness, and objectivity, but sometimes through more heterodox practices dedicated to salvaging the most ephemeral remains that a normative vision of literary history might blithely discard. Like all of Dickinson's writings, the 50-odd envelope texts found in an initial sweep of the major collections vex genre boundaries. Most, however, appear to be rough copy poem drafts. The earliest envelope poem may have been composed around 1864, the date assigned to the last of Dickinson's fascicles, and a handful of other envelope texts, 4 by Johnson's dating, 2 by Franklin's, belong to the same decade. The remaining envelope texts bear composition dates ranging from 1870 to 1885, evidence suggesting that Dickinson's practice of composing on envelopes intensified in the wake of fascicle production, and at a juncture when she was testing differently, and as it turns out for a final time, the relationship between message and medium. Composed, moreover, at the end of a century, whose dream of communication as the mutual communion of souls was often realized or shattered in the fate of written missives, the envelope poems seem charged with a special poignancy and hermeneutical burden. unlike the original communications they enclosed and that still had some chance of reaching their intended addressees. The emptied envelopes, discovered among Dickinson's papers after her death and scattered by the winds of the future, are intercepted by unknown and unnamed readers, permanently estranged from the writer. They remind us of the contingency, transience, vulnerability, and hope embodied in all of our messages. By the late 1850s, writes media historian John Durham Peters, it was possible to mail a letter sealed in an envelope, paid for with a pre-purchase stamp, and dropped into a public box. And in her recent beautiful work on Dickinson, Virginia Jackson considers the many possible forms of address. The way in which I address you depends upon where you are. If you are very near, I can whisper. If you are across the table, I can speak. If you are upstairs or just outside, I can shout. If you are too distant to hear, even to overhear my voice, I can write. And in the illusion peculiar to written address, the condition of your absence, the condition of my writing, conjures a presence more intimate than a whisper. Before bearing poems, the envelopes found among Dickinson's papers presumably carried such cloistered dispatches. Many of the envelopes on which she wrote were originally addressed to her or members of her family from those beyond the world of the homestead. The hands of her Norcross cousins, Josiah and Elizabeth Holland, Abigail Cooper, and Judge Otis Lord, crossed them in ink and committed them to the postal service. The remaining envelopes in this constellation are addressed by Dickinson to cherished outsiders. Unlike the envelopes mailed to her, those she dispatched bear only a name and, on rare occasion, an abbreviated address. Like Dickinson's untitled and undated poems circulating outside of a print economy, the original messages these envelopes presumably enclosed were conveyed privately by more intimate carriers. Neither stamped nor postmarked, they eluded the postal system's public circuits of exchange, and often, as a result, their transmission and reception histories remain untraceable. Returning is a different route, Dickinson wrote around 1874. If the envelopes addressed by Dickinson to others often conveyed communications received but long ago dissociated from their envelopes, lost or destroyed by custom or accident, how and why did the empty envelopes return to her? If, on the contrary, the envelopes never left her possession, why were they addressed at all? And to whom? Were they only potential carriers for communications Dickinson intended to write, but ultimately withheld? Could the poems inscribed on envelopes, both those unsent or returned to her, and those sent to her by others, be the true messages she wished to send but never did? Were they directed to the living or to the dead? The often striking contrast between the address Dickinson composed on the envelope's face in ink in a magnified fair copy script and the poem she inscribed in pencil on its back or inside in the small, dense, rough copy script Higginson described as resembling the fossil tracks of birds seems to point to a split intention in the writer, determined on the one hand to send an indelible message to a particular specific addressee still present and locatable in the world, and desiring on the other hand to compose a fleeting message for a stranger from another unknown world. How can we ever verify the degree of match between what is transmitted and what received? The interval separating address and poem, whether minutes, hours, days, or years, is always infinite. Thus, while it is tempting to see the poems composed on envelopes addressed to the same person as fragments of an extended message to him or her, to see the addressee as somehow enciphered in the poems, the fragmentary narratives that emerge from such an approach remain frustratingly unconnected to identifiable circumstances in the lives of either sender or recipient. What is renounced in the turning of the envelope from face to back is the letters, the poem's potential to conjure the addressee's presence through words. What is affirmed, perhaps in this very same turn, is the mysterious distance separating the sender and receiver, but through which they somehow continue to signal each other. A message enclosed in an envelope, A poem inscribed upon it and prepared for sending over miles or centuries is not a piece of information, but a registry of longings. No wonder, then, that we find among Dickinson's envelope poems several enacting the ecstatic reconciliation of souls. Long years apart can make no breach, a second cannot fill, for example, attest to the power of writing to overcome time and space, to collapse the distance dividing writer and addressee, who recognize each other instantaneously despite a revolution in forms. But this fantasy recurs only rarely in Dickinson's work. More often, the envelope poems emphasize the address gap, depict the vast expanse, sundering writer and reader, so often also lover and beloved. Thus, in Through What Transports of Patience, the addressee is unreachable, separated from the writer who seeks him or her by a void or blank that, unmeasurable on a human scale, cannot be traversed. And similarly, the excruciating poem, A Not Admitting of the Wound, in which we learn only that the source of the speaker's injury is her severance from the beloved, and that the wound is so wide that her entire existence has now entered it, bears witness to the infinite remoteness of our condition. In this case, the translation of the wound into words remains unaccompanied by an interpretive process that might treat the speaker by turning her literal hurt into a figurative one. The envelope is the repository of an injury it cannot heal or even contain. Slit open, it functions not as a soothing bandage, but as a second, almost simultaneous site of rupture. At the end of the 19th century, the rise of the new telecommunications technologies changed the conditions of human contact forever. The new media, writes Peters, gave life to the older dream of angelic contact by claiming to burst the bonds of distance and death. Yet signals sent from a distance must still be kept alive along the way. One of the uncanniest documents in the constellation of Dickinson's writings on envelopes is a Western Union telegraph blank, addressed to Vinnie Dickinson, care of Judge Lord, and marked paid by the sender. The urgent message it conveyed, copied by a nameless telegrapher with strict instructions to carefully read every letter, to repeat obscure sentences or difficult words, and to keep a daily record of all difficulties, interruptions, or incidents occurring in the working of the lines, has been lost. In place, poems, Glass was the street in tinsel peril, and it came its turn to beg. In these poems, Dickinson appears to be translating the electrical pulses of the original and unrecoverable bulletin into new messages associating speed and shock. The distortion and breakdown of this final message, abruptly interrupted by a stranger or a god and registered visually in the repeated cancellations of lines, is evidence that communication across the chasm of worlds is asymmetrical and unreadable. I gave him leave to live, lest gratitude revive the snake thought, though smuggled my reprieve. The 19th century word for envelope was cover, and metaphors of envelopes are metaphors of containment, of exteriority and interiority, of enfolding and exposure. In Dickinson's case, however, the sovereign force of the envelope's address is ultimately countered by the poem's openness to a multiplicity of recipients, an array of futures. The whirring of the envelopes is part of the message they are sending. Slit open, unfolded, written across, and consigned to chance, they reject the asylum offered by the lyric poem to probe the last privacies of our existence. Among Dickinson's envelope poems, we find an exquisite subset of lyric fragments written on seals or flaps. Detached from their original bodies, the seals compose a coda for all Dickinson's late writings received in pieces as fragments. The tiny scale and luminous properties of the seal link it to the world of the miniature, to keepsake or amulet. In writing, the seal is the ideal container for the aphorism, a minimum sign invested with maximal energy. Only a few lines long, the poems inscribed over seals bear witness to the evanescence of existence, brief as a single day or as the isolate, piercing notes of a bird. Saved against all odds, unsealed for all the world to see, they carry Dickinson's last exorbitant message about fame's sightlessness and her final canceled caution against doubt. In this short life that only merely lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power. The vastest earthly day is shrunken, shriveled, dwindled, chastened, small, by one departing, heroic face behind a pall. One note from one bird is better than a million words. A scabbard holds but one sword. Society for me, my misery, since gift of thee, or fame erect her sightless citadel. Which has the wisest men undone? Doubt has. Scatter diagrams. High up, a mile high, perhaps 2 miles high, hundreds of pale gray birds flew south like pages of flickering paper let loose from a small book caught up in a wind. Peter Greenaway. In order to determine whether or not certain kinds of birds possess homing instincts, a person, sometimes called a liberator, throws several up into the air, then turns and turns again, each time releasing more birds in different directions. The birds are then watched out of sight, and the points at which they disappear from view are recorded. When a significant number of vanishing points have been noted, a scatter diagram is drawn up for study. At times, for reasons poorly understood, large numbers of birds set to return to their original release points seem to lose their way and drift widely across the migration axis. Whirling around the absent center of the fascicles, Dickinson's envelope poems resemble these distant migrants that do not come fully into focus and that never constitute a clearly delimitable constellation. If at times one or two seem to be in closest touch, at other times, each seems remote from the others, unassimilated and unassimilatable to a larger figure, whose moving edges and outlines also drift and blur. Like the homing birds gone astray from their flocks, the envelope writings have exchanged the hermetic relations inherent in letters, those fine and private things intended for one intimate and elite addressee, for the more elliptical but finally more far-reaching relations of poems. Whether or not they ever left her papers, Dickinson's envelope poems are still en route, their itinerary open. Their skywriting, their messages dispersed to all sans instructions, may be fleetingly apprehended by anyone with eyes to see or ears to hear. Coda. Suddenly I am letter-struck, Ellen Sissou. Even now, one I did not discover in my searching of the archives, one I missed, one I failed to collect, to gather, suddenly crosses the sky of my reading. I like to imagine that it was sent to me, indirectly of course, by the ghost of J. Leda, for it appears on a brief, incomplete list of envelope poems he made in the 1950s when he was cataloging Dickinson's writings, and which I came across quite by chance a few months ago when sifting his papers for something else. The face of the envelope is addressed by Clara Newman Turner to Lavinia Dickinson in ink the color of a calm blue mixed with lavender. Turn the envelope over, though, and we find on its torn inside Dickinson's sudden penciled notation circa 1876, "Death warrants are supposed to be." What a hazard a letter is. How it seeks us out, how it aims at us. Instead of classifying the envelope poems according to conventional generic codes, instead of collecting them in a single bound volume, we need to find ways of recording each brief encounter we have with them before noting, too, their unpredictable destinies, their many vanishing points. Who knows, but one of them is to us. Thank you.
So to backtrack for a moment or two, I wanted to share the first series of works I did related to Dickinson, and then I'll go straight into the new edition that Marta and I did together with Dickinson's envelope poems. And this series is called the Dickinson Composites. It's based on the fascicles here at the Houghton. And some of you got a great description from Leslie Morris earlier about the variants and how they work in her poems. But in short, by a variant, I mean any word, phrase, or line Dickinson preceded with a cross mark inside the body of the poem, or any word, phrase, or line preceded by a cross mark in a cluster at the end of the poem, like a postscript. In the poem, Bereavement and Their Death to Feel, in the last stanza, you'll see the line, "In dying 'tis as if our souls absconded suddenly." And the word souls has a cross in front of it. Below it is a string of 3 words, first with a cross, world, then a dash, selves, another dash, sun, and another dash. And the way you would read that variant in relation to the poem is to go back into the preceding 2 lines. So you travel backwards into the poem. In dying 'tis as if our world absconded suddenly. In dying 'tis as if ourselves absconded suddenly. In dying 'tis as if our sun absconded suddenly. I loved this system when I came across it. I could hardly believe it. And I could hardly believe what it did to the poem, much less what it did to every other poem she'd written. So when I started to read this way and I went back in and I said, what happens to the word souls when I see it in relation to those 3 words every time? Or, for example, tenderly or sovereignly in the poem Marta showed earlier, my letter to the world, judge tenderly of me, changed to sovereignly of me. I mean, it has a very dramatic effect when you start to apply it or study it that way. And I thought it was extraordinarily beautiful, and then was shocked to find it wasn't really represented in print when her poems were published, and was also aghast about line breaks and other sort of formal aspects of the page that I thought were inherent in their power and beauty and sound. And so I wanted to do something specifically with these marks and with this system that would in some way picture it or make it visually available. And I worked on this series for about 4 years called the Composites, and I digitally composited fascicles of poems. So I would scan in the Franklin facsimile edition, and I would layer every recto on a recto and every verso on a verso in a single fascicle of poems, so in a single packet of poems. So you're looking at a bunch of poems at once when you're looking at these composites, ideally in the space. So what you're looking at there is the folio fold in the center, is that faint green line, and then every mark that was in fascicle packet 16. And I worked throughout the 40 fascicles, and I was interested to see what happened over time. So 16 is the first sort of sweeping use of the cross mark in the fascicles. And they're so large. I compare them, the difference is like dragonflies versus gnats in fascicle 40. And the scale of the letter and the connectedness of the letters in a word changes dramatically from throughout the fascicle sequences. So I started to make these large pictures of it using a combination of cotton batting, muslin, embroidery thread, and cotton thread. And I would first sew the ground of the paper. So if it was on a ruled paper, I'd sew the rule, or the laid lines, I'd sew the laid lines. And the quilts are actually bigger than the screen. So it's a 8 feet wide by 6 feet tall quilt. The embroidered works I made are quite large to convey the exact gesture of Dickinson's individual handwritten marks. I transferred the digital composite marks onto the batting with a projector and a pencil, and embroidered them with red silk thread, red because it consists of the longest wavelengths of light the human eye can see. The Dickinson composites are men's of a mission, samplers of, quote, a system of aesthetics far superior to mine. I wanted to visually reassert the vital presence of the omitted marks, to raise questions about them. Choosing to circumvent what seemed like an intractable editorial situation, I tried to make something as forceful, abstract, and generously beautiful as Dickinson's work is to me. And outside there's an edition that we made for libraries, for scholars who wanted to look at these quilts in library contexts. And there's one at the Houghton, and there's one out there for you to handle and look at. And it has a sampler of the quilts, so it has a one-to-one excerpt. So as if you were to walk up to the quilt and cut out this much of it, it has it reproduced in actual scale. Okay, on to the gorgeous nothings. So I'm going to read the postscript that I wrote, which is quite short. The title, The Gorgeous Nothings, is an excerpt from Emily Dickinson's manuscript A821, The Gorgeous Nothings Which Compose the Sunset Keep. I was thinking of Dickinson's own definition for nothing, the force that renovates the world, and her definition for no, the wildest word we consign to language. These gorgeous nothings are that kind of nothing. These manuscripts are sometimes referred to as scraps. My grandmother's family ran a scrapyard, and judging from the photographs, they had an inordinate amount of fun doing so. The studio where this edition was made, near the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, New York, is within eyeshot of 2 scrapyards. Scrap has value here, and it is on the verge of transformation. The giant mountains of metal will be melted back down and remade, transfigured. It will no longer be called scrap when something new is created from it. I prefer to think of these manuscripts as the sort of small fabric Dickinson writes of in A636. Excuse Emily and her atoms. The North Star is of small fabric, but it implies much, presides yet. Dickinson penciled the poem in one corner of a large envelope interior. The writing is small in relation to the compositional space, floating in its firmament. This poem exemplifies Dickinson's relationship to scale so perfectly. When we say small, we often mean less. But when Dickinson says small, she means fabric, atoms, the North Star. Dickinson's fresh eye for creating a visual composition is overtly demonstrated in the envelope poems. To understand how forcefully she's manipulating the form of the page, take a simple household envelope and see how many of these forms you can recreate. You will rather quickly find that what looks simple simply is not. There is not one instance here of an envelope reopened out into its die-cut shape. Look with care, and you will see that what may look like a whole envelope is only one face of it, slit open. Note how, in 4 of the larger manuscripts, she angled the page to write in concert with the light rule and the laid lines in the paper. In the richness of the color reproductions in the portfolio, the envelope poems appear to visually hover on the thick white page. In reality, the manuscripts are wafer thin. When Dickinson approached her compositional space to write, she was reading and shaping her materials. She was reading light. Dickinson's material vocabulary might best be described as epistolary. The poems, fascicles, letters, and notes were predominantly composed on stationery. Dickinson never used pre-folded folio sheets in their nested format. Each folio was its own unit, even when conjoined with thread to other folios in her fascicles. Sometimes she broke them down further, tearing the paper in 2 at the fold, or smaller yet, pieced to others conjunct with the aid of a pin. The envelopes reproduced here are all machine-made die-cut forms, finished with folds, glued intersections, and a gummed flap the sender could moisten to seal. Most often, the envelope has been slit or cut open at its sides, turned and inscribed in the interior. In an early letter to her brother Austin, she wrote, "This is truly extempore, Austin. I have no notes in my pocket," suggesting that there were typically jottings accumulating there. Dickinson's one surviving dress has an external pocket on the right side where her hand would fall easily at rest. The economy of the pocket is worth considering. An envelope is a pocket. An envelope refolds discreetly, privately, even after it has been sliced completely open. All of the envelope poems were written in pencil. Unlike a fountain pen, a pencil stub, especially a very small one, fits neatly in the pocket of a dress. Emily Dickinson sent this pencil in poem letter 695. "If it had no pencil, would it try mine?" to the Bowleses, wryly nudging them to write. It was enveloped in a small folio folded in thirds horizontally, pinned closed at each side. And that pencil is about 2 inches long to give you a sense of scale. I will just get into nuts and bolts, and then we'll have some time to go look at the edition and read through it and handle it. It's comprised of about 48 prints, full color, 100% scale, front and back. And the scale issue is very important here because when you're looking at the scale on the screen, it's all over the place. They're tiny, they're large, they're giant, but it was of great value for me to actually know what the correct scale was in all of these things. And they're surprisingly small, as you'll find with her in many contexts. The edition is comprised of 3 parts. Mostly comprised of manuscripts from Amherst College, though there is a fantastic one from Houghton, Eternity Will Be, which we were so pleased to include. And the 3 parts are primarily the portfolio of the envelopes, and they are, single sheets unbound, and we wanted them to be non-sequential so that you could group them and reorder them and work with them yourself. I should add that the edition is so strongly for use. We made it so that people would use it and get to see these things. So even though it's a pretty fancy edition, I think of it as a workhorse. I hope it gets a lot I hope it gives at this point. So there's the portfolio of the prints, 48 prints. And we made some new transcriptions of these. They're based on drawings or tracings of the envelope, so those were scanned in. And then I worked with another poet and designer, Mary Austin Speaker, to work on some new transcriptions and try to, as best we could, it was a very challenging feat, and I'm not sure we did it the best way, but we did it the best way we could. We tried to scale and angle and size the letters in a way that was conducive to reading on the page. So we tried to treat the transcription like a key, like something you would consult to look back into and at the manuscript. So it has a very specific relationship to the experience. That we wanted it to be secondary, and we wanted it to be a resource, not something that would stand equal to the manuscript. It's also, we're very lucky to have the essay that you heard a version of by Marta Werner as part of the edition. That's the only bound thing in the edition because it has a set sequence that's very important, and it has manuscripts tipped into it, or facsimile manuscripts tipped into it. And there's also a guide which is unbound, and that sorts the fragments by form, by address, by variants, by erasures, by writing directions. So there are these groupings, very quick visual groupings that you can use when you're looking at the book to look for certain things. There's a lot of invisible labor that goes into something like this. And one invisible labor that I particularly liked was the half a year we spent removing the space around each manuscript. So when you look at that reproduction up there, all the space around within a pixel or two, sort of right where the shadow starts, had to be removed in such a way that the manuscript would appear to float on the page when you saw it. So often when people see the edition for the first time, they do this. They run their hand over it to see if it's actually on there. And that was a carefully constructed illusion that we enjoyed laboring on. Okay. And Marta mentioned this manuscript, long years apart can make no breach, a second cannot fill. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately because it has, the poem continues onto the back, as you saw. And you get that a little bit better when they're two up, actually. But what happens is that the right-hand poem and the left-hand poem continue on the back on the right hand and the left hand. So there's this opportunity to make a folio that would follow a normal folio sequence, and she doesn't take it. And this sort of column structure, I think, is really curious, and I was looking at it in relation to Robert Walser's work lately, because I think it mimics newspapers, actually. And it's a great, I think it actually has a lot of promise as a publishing solution for Dickinson, because her line breaks are so short and her poems are so narrow that one of the difficulties of publishing a poem that short or that narrow on a page is that it takes up a ton of white space. If you were to do it in columns, as she's done here, you might actually have a pretty workable reading solution. I was so excited when I realized that. Anyway, but I love using one of the things that was particularly exciting to me about getting to do this edition is that it's for use. So we can sort of work through things like this because we have them in front of us, because we're using them, because we're reading them that way. And these sorts of solutions that are most sympathetic to how Dickinson is writing and the choices that she's making as she's composing, it's very difficult to get close to what she's doing, and I feel like we get a little closer each generation, or maybe not, but it's exciting to try. And there's all of these clues that she leaves, I feel like, in the manuscripts themselves that offer up new potential publications. I should also say that I learned about these fragments through Marta Werner. So it was through open folios and through radical scatters that I first saw these, that I knew that they existed. So I only knew about the fascicles and had seen individual late fragments published. So it was entirely through their existence, through your work, that they were even known to me. And so there's a huge debt, I think, in the scholarship right now to the work you've done and are doing, and its beauty astounds me, and so I'm pleased that we get to manifest it anew. One thing, that last fragment ends, will gleam and understand. It says stir, and there's a line, will gleam and understand. And one of the things that was fun to do with the edition was to try to carry over some of the material resonance of the archive. So when you look at the seals in the archive, they do glisten. They have such presence that you can't capture in a photograph. And so we kept trying to sort of, if the trade-off was to get a great print on thick paper, we would print the essay on really thin Weston's linen, which was a paper that she used to compose on. The watermark differs by almost a century, but so we would try to get the thinness and the translucency and the crispness of that paper in the essay on letterpress, and then capture things like the glistening seal on the outside of the box. So there were sort of these hints of that experience coming through in other ways if they couldn't be experienced in the manuscript version. Okay, I close with that, and I invite you to look at all three editions and open folios, and to congregate and converse. Thank you.